what federalism looks like. Okay, if you remember the example I give, if you want to look at current or actually have are according to states. All right, y'all. User Nguyen here, and this is a video to help you guys get through at least set a baseline of understanding for the first playlist in your AP Gov Federalism. Okay, so hopefully through this you can get a little bit of baseline knowledge through it, and afterwards, should you need to fill in the blanks, you can go through the resources with a better understanding, and so the words and the readings won't be as confusing. Okay, and so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through the terms, or the most important terms to get through the playlist, and then fill in the blanks with what other concepts or terms or ideas that come up in a playlist that aren't explicitly stated in terms. Okay, and so to start, we're going to first define what a federal system is. Okay. And so what a federal system is, and if you remember this from class, I'm just going to say it as a separation, a legal separation of governments, right? What does that imply about the number of governments? We have more than one, right? And so depending on where you live, should you live in California, right, you follow not only federal laws, but you also follow California laws, okay? Just to give you the theoretical model of what federalism looks like, it's that little pyramid, right? And at the very top, you have federal government. Next, you have state government. Then you have county government, and then city, also known as municipality. Okay. In the order from the topmost has the most power, right? And so federal government, should they make a law, everybody below it has to follow. State, if they make a law, everybody below state has to follow, and so on and so on. The next thing you need to know is what a confederation is. Okay. If you remember from class, I'll go over it one more time. What a confederation is a friendly union of sovereign states, right? The example I give folks is that pretend, right, federal government made no laws, and so the only laws you had to follow were California's, right? And so what would that mean for other states is if you left California, went to Nebraska, say, you would have to follow completely different laws. In a classroom example, the example I give folks is that pretend if Miss Riley and Miss Ching never made any of the rules, right? And only the teachers made rules. What that would mean is if you went to one classroom, it may be vastly different than if you went to another classroom. That's what a confederation is. Going on to the opposite of a confederation, you have a unitary system, right? If you break down the word, uni means one. And so if you think about it, it's only one government. Other words, centralized power, right? One lawmaking body to make all the rules for a society. The example I give, if you want to look at current or actual unitary systems nowadays, you can look at Great Britain, right? They don't have municipalities, they don't have counties, right? They just have one law-making parliament to make laws for everybody, okay? An example I give to students to make it more relatable in school is imagine if I and all the other teachers made none of the rules, and only Miss Ching and Miss Riley made rules, okay? As you can imagine, if they were the only ones making rules, one classroom would be almost exactly the same as another classroom, okay? That's what the unitary want to go over is the 10th Amendment, okay? We're going to look at all the other amendments in the Constitution further down in different projects and units, but for the sake of this content assessment, you need to know the 10th. Because in a nutshell, right, this essentially establishes federalism, right? Federalism, that legal separation of governments. And what the 10th Amendment states is that powers not granted to Congress, right? Not in that sacred document that says you, Congress, do this, 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 and this, right? That aren't said there are thus going to the states. Okay. For example, right? Congress in the Constitution it says nothing about schools, nothing at all. And so all the laws pertaining to schools typically fall in states' hands. Another example is voting laws. Besides the Electoral College and how many representatives are made up in Congress, voting laws, in other words, how people should vote according to whatever state rules they have, are according to states. Think of it as like a job description where one person says, you do X, Y, Z. Everything else that I didn't say, the other person does it. Okay? That's what the 10th Amendment essentially establishes. Now, the next thing we want to talk about are delegated powers, okay? In your term list, they call them delegated powers, but in almost everywhere else that you will see it, including your AP test, they will be known as enumerated powers. Okay. Enumerated translates directly to listed, right? Listed powers, if you break it down. What these are, if you think of things that are on a list, right, that you can clearly see them. These you can think of them as obvious powers, okay? The ones clearly stated under Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Okay. You might get a question about this, and most of the time, you just need to know where they come from. Article 1, Section 8. The place politicians, the place scholars, the place high school teachers cite most often is this particular article and section right here. Okay, the way you can think about this is obvious powers. Think of it as the things in your job description. Say you had a job, right, that you clearly have to do. Okay, for example, if I was hired as a bag boy, the very obvious job descriptions I have are bag groceries, clean the bathrooms, bring in the carts, right? Everywhere in between, it's a toss-up. But those we can point to and say that is what you are going to do. Now, the more interesting part, in my opinion, uh, with these terms specifically, is the next one called implied powers. Okay, think about things that are implied in everyday conversations, right? If I imply that you are not doing work, I might say something passive aggressive like, hey, have you looked at your grades yet? I'm not explicitly saying it, but I'm hinting at it, right? Implied powers are the exact same thing, where you can think of it as less obvious, right? Where you are kind of saying it, but you're not exactly saying it, okay? What you need to know most is that it's derived from what we call the necessary and proper clause. I don't have my little constitution on me, but if you have it, you can look it up. In Article 1, Section 8, where all the enumerated powers are, at the very end, it states that Congress has the power to make all laws necessary and proper in executing their foregoing powers. Okay. Necessary and proper, right? I'll give you an example to help you understand what that means. Okay. One of the powers that Congress has is to make post offices. Pretty plain and simple, right? Congress, make post offices. Okay, then I'll make post offices, right? But oftentimes, the next question that comes up is, how am I going to do that, right? Does that mean I can tax folks an exorbitant amount to establish post offices in more rural areas, right? Does that mean I can take away somebody's property in order to establish a post office, right? Does that mean that I can force states to set up different committees and how to plan out how to make post offices, right? And so what you get, right, is you get sometimes Folks that use this specific clause to justify questionable actions. Okay, I'll give you another example. Okay, let's say, for example, I gave you a job, and the job was to keep a clean store, right? Okay. That was your job, and I put it in a contract, right? Those are, so to speak, your enumerated, right, duties. Okay. Now, the next question that might come in your mind is, how do you want me to do that, right? Right? Does that mean I can borrow $50,000 from the company in order to buy mops? Does that mean I can order anything I want off of Amazon to decorate the store? Does that mean I can hire other people to help me keep a clean store? Right? And so if something comes up, right, you can always just point to this thing and say, well, you said I have to keep a clean store, and that's what I did. That's what I'm doing. Okay. That's kind of to give you an idea of how sometimes the question it can be questionable when people say, well, it's necessary proper to do my job. The next two terms I want to go through, I'm going to lump them together because I think to gain a better understanding of them, I can just kind of lump them together so you can get a general idea of what they are. There are minor differences between the two. While they are important, should you go to higher level political science classes, and maybe in the AP test they might quiz you about the differences of it. I doubt it. But for the sake of the content assessment and just gaining a base level of understanding, I'm going to lump them together. Okay. So the two terms that I'm going to throw at you are going to be called the full faith and credit clause and the privileges and immunities clause. Okay. And all this means, right, is that states must respect the laws and court orders from other states. Okay. Um, I'll give you an example of what this looks like in action, right? This clause, these two clauses lumped together, are the reason why, if you have a driver's license, right, it's valid in all 50 states, right? This clause, these clauses are the reason why your passport, right, your birth certificate, are valid in other states, even though you were certified through the state, right? This clause is the reason why, say, if you committed a crime, right, and you owed the state a great deal of money, and all of a sudden it accumulated a bunch of debt, and you said, well, screw that, I'm going to leave town. The cops ain't going to find me in Montana, right? That if Montana found you and there was a warrant out for your arrest, right, they wouldn't try you there. They would send you back to California, right? This is the clause that makes that so. Okay. Now, the next thing we need to go over is something called the Commerce Clause. We've talked about this extensively in the class and how sometimes, right, or a lot of times, commerce can be interpreted in very broad and sometimes questionable degrees. I'm going to state what it is first. It is Congress may regulate commerce among the several states. Okay. I omitted other parts, right? If you look at the Constitution, it specifically says with foreign nations and among the native tribes, right? But for the sake of the content assessment, you need to know that it can regulate among the other states, right? And so, in other words, interstate commerce. Okay. Now, when you go through the content assessment, it's going to ask you not what the Commerce Clause is, but rather when it was flexed for the first time, right? When I say flexed, right, I just mean, right, when they used it, right? If I gave you a job and I said, hey, Jim, you can take $5 from everybody in this class. I give you that power, right? Now everybody's waiting anxiously to see, will Jim actually use that power? Okay, that's essentially what's asking here, is that when did Congress actually use it? And it dates back where the Supreme Court solidified this power in a case called Gibbons v. Ogden. And so I'll tell you the story of the case. The story of the case is that Gibbons was a dock owner, right, in the state of New York. And New York had decided to give Gibbons a monopoly over the docks, right? For those that don't know what a monopoly is, right? A monopoly is just a fancy way of saying one seller, many buyers, right? Think of it like this, right? If you are the only person selling something in a given area, right? What can you sell for? You could sell it for any price you want, right? Where else are you going to get it? Okay. So that's what Gibbons had. He had a monopoly, right? And so he could charge any price he practically wanted to. Ogden, one day, was a ferry boat owner. Okay, and I believe the facts of the case, and you can fact check me on this and call me out after class or something like that, was that his boat broke down and he decided to dock in New York City. Okay, the thing is that Gibbons charged him a different price, right? Not because of maybe services or whatnot, but because he was from another state. Okay, and Ogden said that's not fair. Okay, you can't charge me a different price simply because where I came from. Okay, and so Congress stepped in to intervene and said, Gibbons, okay, in New York, you have to set a fixed price for those docking in your state. Okay, it's not fair for other states, right? It interferes with the commerce of your state. And so it went to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said, okay, yes, Ogden, you're right. Gibbons, you're wrong, right? Congress may, right, prevent states from setting up laws that interfere with interstate commerce, right? Congress may uh, regulate commerce in order to prevent states from interfering with interstate commerce, right? And so this is the first time it was really used, and it set the precedent that Congress, right, that states if you if you do something to disrupt the flow of commerce state to state, right, Congress can jump in and say, hey, that's not fair. Okay, we're going to set the rules here. The next thing we need to go over is something called the Supremacy Clause. Okay, the definition of the Supremacy Clause upfront is that if Fed and state law ever conflict, right? If one says one thing, and the other contradicts it, right? That Fed will always win. Okay. Just to give you an example, right? Right. If Fed law made some kind of a law about marijuana and said it was illegal, right? And if state law said something about marijuana that said it is legal, right? Technically speaking, if it was brought to court and questioned, right, Fed would win. Okay. Now, this power isn't explicit in the Constitution, but I'll tell you where and what case kind of established that it is in the Constitution, implied, of course. Uh, and so the first time it was flexed, or rather when it was established, it was in a case called Maryland versus McCulloch, right, in 1819, right? And so the story of the case goes that that the federal government had established a bank, right? A bank in the state of Maryland, right? Pretty standard, right? And Maryland, right? decided shortly after to impose a tax for those living in Maryland. Pretty standard, right? The thing was uh, that Maryland ended up taxing the federal bank, right? Now, the problem with that, right, is that if we look at this little model of federalism again, that you have a state, right, taxing Fed, right, a higher power, right? Um, Now the conflict was a big one, right? Because if you think of it in terms of siblings, right? Let's think of it as if you had a younger brother or younger sister, and your younger sibling went up to you and said, "Hey, you have to be home by 7 p.m. because I told you so." Okay. Now I don't know about you, but I'd probably be like, "Whoa, I don't know who you are to tell me that I need to be home." Okay. I thought I was the older one. Okay. I thought I was supreme. Okay. And so that was the conflict that arose in Maryland versus McCulloch. Okay. And so um, it went to the Supreme Court, right? And in a nutshell, right, the Supreme Court said that there is something called a supremacy clause, that it is implied in the necessary and proper clause that Fed law will always win against state law, right? And the justification for it was that if Fed law doesn't win, right, if there were exceptions to it, there is no point in the Constitution, right? If sometimes it doesn't win, what's the point of giving Congress power, right? That if you knew that something could just be overridden, you would just never follow the rules, right? And so in this case, um, through the necessary and proper clause, right, it was implied, right, that a supremacy clause was established. Okay. So you will be asked in your content assessment, in your test, about different types of federalism. Okay. There are some might run into some, others, some won't even run into them at all. But it is important to know, just for, right, how federalism actually works out in today's world. And so the four types to go over are going to be dual, cooperative, progressive, and fiscal, right? I'll start from left to right and then end with fiscal because there's a little bit more to this that needs explaining. Okay. Dual, in short, right, in real simple, is that state and Fed have equal power, right? These drawings are to symbolize the amount of power that they have, right? And so you see in this picture that they're both equal size, right? And so it's still supposed to symbolize that state and Fed, right? When they're making rules or have powers over certain decisions, right? They have equal amount, right? Ways that this shows up today are when, right, state and Fed are able to tax you, right? When you look at your paycheck, state takes some money out of your paycheck and federal government takes some money out of your paycheck. Okay. There are exceptions in different states. Some states don't have income taxes, right, but they make it up in other taxes, right? The next federalism we want to go over is something called cooperative, right? And cooperative basically just means that um, fed and state powers are intertwined, right? That if I were to draw it out, that there's no real clear definition, or if there are, it's kind of in different rivets, right? Where sometimes, right, maybe Fed might take the mantle on a certain decision, right, and then maybe federal government might take the mantle on a different decision, right, and they kind of switch partners, switch roles as to who should do certain things, right? Um, think of this as, right, ill-defined powers, right? Sometimes they do this, sometimes they don't enforce this, um, right? Some examples of that could be, um, right, immigration stuff. marijuana stuff, sometimes it's intertwined, right? Where sometimes they just say, well, y'all can take care of that. We won't enforce it that much, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. The next one is going to be progressive federalism, right? Progressive federalism in the power picture that I have here, you can see that Fed is a little bit smaller than state. Okay, and what this just means is that Fed, right? Fed government grants states more power. Okay, that states will take the steering wheel from most for a particular issue or for most things, right? A modern day example of this one is states in regard to environmental laws, right? Um, Federal government might go up to a state and say, we can't really handle this. Okay, California, we're gonna ask you, can y'all take the mantle on handling environmental issues? Because us indeed won't be really effective doing it. So states, we're gonna make sure that you guys do it well. Okay, that's what progressive federalism is. Okay, the last one to go through is called fiscal federalism. Okay, if we break this down, fiscal just means money, right? If you ever read a book on business or ever heard something on a podcast or something like that, a fiscal year, they're talking about money made in a certain calendar of years, right? Where they frame sales and whatnot. Think of fiscal as money. It's just money. Okay. Um, what it means is federalism enforced with money. Okay. For example, right? State, if you don't follow our rules, we will take a certain grant away. We will take some money away. Okay. For example, if your parents say, "Hey, if you don't do the chores, I'm not going to give you allowance." Right? That's kind of that's what fiscal federalism is. Okay. Now, there's two different types of money, generally speaking, that federal government can give or take away from states. Okay. The two are called category grants, and then you have block grants. Okay. Category grants is money for specific purposes. Okay. I'll explain this in a second. Block grants are just a chunk of money uh, for for any spending, right? For any, it's up to the state's discretion, right? um, an example of this is right category grants, right? Say the federal government says if you need to follow our our health care regulations, right? And to help you out with it, right? We're going to give you a bunch of money, but you must spend it on things related to health care and or health insurance, right? You can't spend it anywhere else, right? Um, that's what a category grant is, right? A block grant is basically just a chunk of money. It's a check, so to speak, right? Where federal government, right? Let's say, for example, federal government gets a lot of money to states for schools, right? One simple thing they might say is maybe, hey, follow our food restrictions for schools, right? And we'll just give you a block of money. You can spend it however you want, but thank you for following our regulations and rules because we think it's important, right? That's what a block grant is, right? Block grants are more flexible, right? You can get that blank check and you could spend it on something stupid, right? Category grants, right? You don't have that option. You have to spend it on whatever they told you to spend it on. So the last thing we'll go over is something called selective incorporation. Now, admittedly, my own bias is that I don't like that this is on this particular content assessment. Um, just because we go through it in depth in a later project called Know Your Rights. Um, regardless, chances are you're going to run into some questions relating to this. Okay, and so just in a nutshell, right? Selective incorporation means gradually applying the Bill of Rights onto the states. Okay, just for reference, right? The Bill of Rights is another way of saying the first 10 amendments. Okay, right, the First Amendment, right? Your freedom of speech, right? The Second Amendment, your right to bear arms. The Fourth Amendment, right? Due process, right? The Fifth Amendment, just compensation, right? Et cetera, et cetera.